Thank you, Benjamin, for the introduction, and thank you, Paco, for inviting me to come to the University of Illinois. I'm very humbled, very excited. This is my first solo lecture in a while, so it's nice to know that the University of Illinois somehow values what I bring to the table, and I'm excited to talk to everyone tonight. I will say that some of the people who graduated from Urbana-Champaign, they messaged me and they said, "Oh, it's great that you're going to be lecturing there," but that's so strange because from what I understand, this is a very technical school, and you'll see that my outlook is a little bit different, which I hope is part of the reason why I was invited to come tonight. And it's because of, I guess, the diverse skill set and worldview that I want to include in my architectural research and my teaching as well. So I think that where we can start off is by clarifying that my approach to architecture is, I try to include a wider description that goes beyond the design of the building. It's one that engages with a place, whether that's a building or a public space, and its history and its baggage, and that's what we call the politics of space. When I say politics, I'm not necessarily referring to politics as in our governmental parties and their personal interactions. I'm talking about the rules of the game for different spaces. And yes, there are laws that govern over them, but I'm also interested in the powers that control what we do there. And very importantly, who gets to participate in those spaces and who gets excluded from those spaces. So my queerly political architectural practices seeks to acknowledge and pinpoint some of these politics, but also to kind of highlight and tap into the power that we have to destabilize them. And that introduction that Benji gave is just a really academic, super formal way of saying something that is actually much more simple and much more closer to what I write in my Instagram bio, which is I teach, I write, I make, I research, I draw, I publish, I queer, I strut, I repeat. So since 2011, my research has explored the relationship between digital spaces and the built environment. And that includes both buildings and urban spaces. And for the last several years, 4 or 5 years, I have focused my interests into how these dynamics have been shaping and informing Puerto Rican queer culture, particularly using San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico, as my case study. So the first thing that I would like to do now is to contextualize the word queer, because I know that this is a very difficult word to disentangle, and particularly because queer is about entanglement. It's not about defining, it's about undefining, and it's a tool to question. So when I talk about queer, I am talking about, and this is me in my personal work, and I always like to make that note that some people might use it differently. The way that I use it is as a way to talk about identities that do not correspond to conventional ideas of sexual orientation and gender performance. So they don't necessarily subscribe to male, female across a whole plethora of a gamma of ways of being and seeing the world. So queerness to me acts as an immense umbrella of non-normative identities, practices, and locations. And it includes a diversity of expressions which do not necessarily fall under the categories of the widely known gay, bisexual, or lesbian. I use queer because it includes more people, not less. And it can include people who actively reject labels, and can include people who partake in non-straight behavior, but don't identify as either lesbian or gay. And it can include people who have different types of bodies, differently abled bodies, different worldviews, etc. So these identities, the queer community, have all been invisibilized and disregarded throughout Puerto Rican history in terms of architecture. And we really continue to struggle to be validated and recognized in terms of civil rights and legislation. And this in turn points to a continued displacement within the built environment. There is an immense need for housing, an immense need for spaces of congregation, an immense need for facilities for healthcare, for places of leisure, for venues for performances, among others. So, for instance, I love this photo. It's not a new photo, but it's of the Rio Piedras drag queer scene, and it includes drag kings and drag queens. And I've interviewed several people throughout the last few years, and some of the things that have come up in those interviews, they've expressed that after the impact of hurricane, and when I say they, and it's not necessarily the people on this picture, I'm talking about my participants in general. They talked about the impact of Hurricane Maria in 2017, and like most sectors in Puerto Rico, queer sites and LGBTQ venues have closed. Not all of them, but many of them. So the queer community has been forced to find new spaces to occupy. And there has been an increase in drag kings and queens organizing queer nights, usually once a month in each venue. And these can be at straight bars, it could be at clubs, it could be at alleys, and even in donut shops in San Juan. And these venues become queered, and I talk about queered as the verb to make something queer, to challenge heteronormativity for a few hours, and then they return to the regular heteronormative coding of space. So what I think is that even though there's upsides to this, like for example, it gives a young group of people who might not have the financial means to purchase a space, and it just gives them the opportunity to put their art out there and create a space for the queer community. It also comes with some cons, and some of the things that I have identified, and I'm sure that we could add to this list, is that what it's pointing to is that Puerto Rico, the queer community in Puerto Rico, lacks legitimate and lawful claim over physical spaces, including real estate. And it leaves us reliant on other stakeholders, and these usually are heterosexual business owners who sanction queer events in their venues as ways to boost their sales on off peaks of the night. And secondly, the other problem that I see is that queerness is severely displaced rather than localized, and not having a solid nucleus and ownership over our architectures can mean that we just as easily can be rendered unwanted, uninvited, and excluded by people who might, could, and do get away with it. So part of my writing and research method is the fragments. And you'll see that throughout this presentation, this idea of fragmentation will play out. And that's because I'm not necessarily interested, and I've been saying this for about a year, I'm not necessarily interested in constructing a linear account of queer histories or practices in Puerto Rico. So I'm more interested in seeing it as patchwork instead of the whole blanket. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but I do have references that I look towards. I have theoretical people, theorists, who I love the work that they do and that allow me and give me certain freedom to do a fragmented approach of what I call theoretical production. So these are the three texts that I mention the most in my work, and maybe this will change in the next few years as I transition into more particular grounds. But for now, these are the three books that have really, really helped me drive the research forward. So we have Samuel Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. We have Jane Rendell's Site Writing, The Architecture of Art Criticism. And we have Javier Laureano's San Juan Gay, Conquista de un Espacio Urbano, de 1948 a 1991. And because the first two might be more widely known and internationally circulated, I would like to unpack here the contributions that Laureano's book has on Puerto Rican queer history and how my work somehow extends from his. So in 2016, historian Javier Laureano published this book, San Juan Gay, and to date, this book is the only historical documentation of the San Juan queer community's relation to the city spaces. Other studies, we have other studies, but a lot of them have to do with migration, with literature, with masculinity, etc. But how Laureano conducts his research through the archive, and he traces the spaces and events that molded gay culture during the second half of the 20th century. And according to his research, there are two major factors that contributed to our queer history becoming severely fragmented. So again, it's this idea of, I can't construct a linear, clean account because the information itself and the way that the community appropriates spaces in Puerto Rico is fragmented in itself. So he says that there's two things. The first factor is the high number of migrants from Puerto Rico that moved to the US mainland. And this is because they wanted to flee from stigma and marginalization. So a lot of them moved to more progressive cities like New York, particularly during the 70s and the 80s. And they also looked for greater career opportunities. And we definitely saw that happen again after 2017, when we had Hurricane Maria and really screwed up the economy once more. And then the other thing that this raises is that the issue of a diaspora introduces a major hurdle in the attempt to recover an urban historical past of queerness in the island, because previously homosexuality was punishable by law. There isn't a lot of documentation left, and the things that we do have, a lot of them have left with the people that lived throughout these times. And the other part of the problem has to do with the loss of a spatial history of queerness due to the high death toll of the queer people who died during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and the 1990s. And in Puerto Rico, the AIDS virus mercilessly and violently eradicated approximately 63% of those infected with the virus. So that's approximately 4,336 people. And it's one of the highest percentages of death by the virus at a global scale at the time. Laureano writes that the arrival of the virus to the island coincides with the exact moment when Puerto Rico was consolidating itself within San Juan's urban morphology, when queer culture was at its historical peak of visibility within the public sphere. So what happens with when Javier Laureano finishes San Juan Gay is that he makes a call at the end of the book, and he acknowledges that his work is not enough, and he invites further research into the urban history of the Puerto Rican LGBTQ community, suggesting that an urgent project that we need is the construction of what he calls a queer archive. And Laureano writes that the queer archive is not homogeneous or definite. It constitutes a type of subjectivity that escapes normalization and docility. This type of memory is rhizomatic, meaning it is multiple. There is no single queer archive, but rather a multitude of them. However, it is necessary to address them, preserve them, safeguard their traces so that we can recover their histories as an act of justice. And this is my translation from his book, which is in Spanish. And from within my field, which is architecture, there has not been a critical understanding nor consideration of LGBTQ plus spaces within Puerto Rican architectural history, theory, or design, particularly because these are spaces appropriated and created by minorities for minorities, not by celebrated male architects who design for an elite group. So we queer people have been excluded not just from architectural history, but from urban planning, from revitalization efforts, from subsidiary considerations from the government, and we've been pushed out from plain view in an attempt to uphold a wholesome Christian-centered cultural image in the island. And this is, I believe, something that is seen in different cities across the world, and it touches points in Samuel Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, which is this wonderful book that he divides in two parts. That's why it's called Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. So in writing in an autoethnographic tone, like from his own experiences, the first part of the book, Delaney narrates and describes his experiences in New York City's red light queer circuit and the network of spaces relevant to these, such as pornographic movie theaters, for instance. While the second part of the book is written in a more academic tone, and it discusses the spatial politics of Times Square regeneration scheme, which ultimately wiped out these aforementioned spatial networks. I'm talking about video shops, talking about coffee shops, I'm talking about cinemas, I'm talking about clubs and bars, and it displaced them outside of Times Square. And the idea behind this was to clean up Times Square to attract multi-billion-dollar investments and clean up the area. So what I have personally found intriguing and helpful is Delaney's mode of writing and structuring this book, this ability to write the book in one tone in the first half and a completely different tone with a different strategy in the second part, because it allowed me to not obsess over reconstructing this linear, tidy account of queer spaces and practices in Puerto Rico. So instead, it enables me to draw from the fragmented state of things and to create patches of information rather than entire blankets. Delaney writes of his book that a few readers have suggested not so much that the two pieces are good to think with, but rather that their very differences make them particularly productive for thinking about and against and through each other. I am interested in the potential of my own pieces, my fragments, communicating among each other through multiple configurations of prepositions. And these are texts that engage against each other, through each other, but also with, across, under, beside, during, and towards each other. This attraction towards prepositions is something I directly borrow from architect and feminist theorist Jane Rendell in her book, Sight Writing. So in it, Rendell is interested in acknowledging the body and the subjectivity of the critic when critiquing or theorizing on a piece of art or a site or a space. So Rendell considers what happens when a critic no longer writes about a piece, doesn't write about architecture, but rather changes that preposition to produce something new. So for Rendell, a shift in preposition allows a different dynamic of power to be articulated, where, for example, the terms of domination and subjugation indicated by over and under can be replaced by the equivalent suggested by to and with. And this is a little bit convoluted for when you hear it for the first time. And I deal with this sometimes with my students right now. And I ask them to rethink about their relationship to how they're doing their architectural research in their MArch dissertations. And I ask them to not think about the fact that they are writing about architecture, but to think, what is it like to write with architecture or write towards architecture? And it doesn't make sense because the preposition destabilizes what we think we need to do. So they're like, I don't know how to do that. And that's the point. We need to come up with new ways to address architecture, where we're not just somebody from the outside looking down on something else. So I don't really believe even in objectivity in the research process. I truly believe it's completely subjective, and I know that is a very feminist way of approaching it. So by incorporating mixed research methodologies in my work, so these include architectural drawings, models, teaching, exhibitions, lectures, journal articles, books, etc., I have come across ensuing questions and concerns regarding the politics of space, belonging, placemaking, and marginalization for the Puerto Rican queer community. And through my work, I try to look for diverse ways to engage as well as disrupt architecture and public spaces with, across, through, from, and towards queerness. So tonight's presentation will be made of fragments of different kinds of work that I've produced. And some of these are models, and some of them are films, and some of them are installations, and some of them are maps. But because I wanted to not be too theoretical in my presentation, but bring examples of how I'm queering architectural research or how I'm doing architectural research for the queer community. I think that it's both. I wanted to bring some examples of how I'm doing it. And again, this is not the only way to do it. This is the way that I've been kind of exploring the topic. So I want to begin with Lost Sites. And this was an work in progress exhibition. And it was part of my previously funded FIPI research project, which was from 2017 to 2019. With that project, I was exploring how mobile technologies were changing and informing queer practices and queer spaces in San Juan. This was the exhibition that launched alongside an international conference. And through this project, I attempted to validate queerness within architectural discourse by creating a cultural register of the public spaces where it unfolds today, particularly when in Puerto Rico, the architecture discipline, as I mentioned, has been unconcerned with creating this architectural record or history or theorization or even acknowledgement of LGBTQ spaces and practices. So to do this, I borrow architectural representations and methods and vocabulary, and I queer them. And again, I use this word queer as the verb in an attempt to question their established meanings and context or fixity. Like I draw on AutoCAD and I use typical materials that we use to make models, but I try to queer them to contest the fixity of what an architectural model is and what it represents. So the current focus of the word site, again, which is the name of the exhibition, is in itself part of the discussion. In architecture, as we know, a site is a fixed, measurable, quantifiable plot of land, often regulated by governmental regulations and normative political structures. So one of the notable characteristics of queer spaces in San Juan is that these are often ephemeral. People appropriate heteronormative public space, and then they queer them through short-term, non-straight spatial practices and artistic performances, nighttime activities, and cultural events. And the appropriation of urban spaces by queer Puerto Ricans carries on a legacy which dates back to the 1960s, when the first queer urban circuits were identified and documented. And these are spaces that have been occupied at times illicitly, especially when it was illegal to be gay or queer, to fulfill a series of needs, which have to do with being seen, with human rights, with the ability to work, being able to socialize, and as well to be able to have sex. So as speculative models, los sites reference and point towards spatial queerness. They break rules. They are architectural publications that suggest recurrent themes in my research of San Juan's queer space, such as fragmentation, mobility, unfixity, displacement, constraint, whim, and ephemerality. Through lost sites, I sought to undo knowability, to question normative structures, to dispute architectural conventions, and to confront architectural discourse. So to do this, I generated certain gestures, such as removing the actual queer buildings and reimagining them as single marbles, imprinting out-of-bounds shapes onto the site surface for the marbles to occupy. The models are also movable objects, and they can be reconfigured and rearranged amongst themselves, creating new landscapes and topographies. Through their different heights and color schemes, they allow multiple accidental and surprising readings, suggesting spaces of programmatic ambiguity and ephemerality, as well as spaces that are often invisible to those outside of the queer circuit. These are a series of maps that I included in the gallery as part of the research itself, and I'll discuss these maps a little bit later on. And then these are some of the interviews that I did with various queer people in the Puerto Rican queer community, and I printed these almost like really, really, really long text messages. And I absolutely loved this image of people really engaging with them. You know, I loved that people stopped and they started reading the stories of these queer people, these stories that were intensely private and personal, but needed to be known and shared. And I felt it was very moving and quite a successful exercise of telling stories of people who don't normally get to tell their stories. And each model had, well, most of them had this brief kind of story behind them so that you would really be able to understand what they represented. And their stories were published on my research website, El Site. So this, for example, I Fell in Love with the Seaside is a little story written in a very Jane Rendell / Samuel Delaney mode, where the text is different because it says different things. And this is the story that accompanied this model in particular, which is a site in Dorado, which is a town on the north of Puerto Rico. And this is a story about loss and love, which brings me to this next project, but maybe I should say a little bit more about this. So just, you'll see that there are marbles imprinted here. And at times I wanted the audience to not know if they were looking at toys or if they were looking at architectural models themselves. And when I was putting together the exhibition, I was thinking about what the identity of these models would be. I was playing around again with this idea of not having it look like it was completely, like it was an attempt to be objective, but rather that I was embracing how subjective it was and for people to be able to see architecture through my eyes. And the idea of the marble, for example, came from my first recollection of when I first felt that I could not express my identity out in public. So I was probably about 4 or 5, 6, and I was at my Baptist school on the west coast of the island. And we were, my group and I, we were around this area where we used to play marbles. And I told this kid in my class that I thought that he was really cute. And my teacher overheard me and she reprimanded me and she told me that I could not say that to other boys, that was not allowed. And it was the first time I felt that I did something wrong out in public, and I knew that I could not say these things anymore. So I wanted the visual language of these models to play around with that part of my identity. So yes, these formal gestures and design strategies are rooted in significant moments of queerness during my own boyhood. And in this way, although lost sites are registers of particular queer locations in San Juan, they also act as my own autobiographical artifacts. So the aspect of playing with prepositions, it implies the presence of a body. You know, if you are under something or you are beside something, it implies that you have a specific coordinate in relation to the object of study and in relation to the research itself. So I've been really kind of exploring how deep I can get in the process and how much I mark my body itself, which now leads me to buildings, bodies, and broken hearts. And okay, so I should say that this is an experiment that I was doing, and it's probably the least theoretical out of all of them. I prefer to do something and then figure out the reasons why I did it later. And I was exploring this aspect of the subjective and about the role of the body in architectural research and about vulnerability. And when I did this, it was right at the beginning, like a month into quarantine during COVID. And I had just broken up with my former boyfriend. And I was locked in my room and in my apartment. And I was just overwhelmed with all this sadness. And I was just like, I thought, I don't know what to do with this. And I came across this book called Sanatorium by this queer artist and writer called Abby Palmer. And it's to me, it's a wonderful book. She is a differently abled artist, and she has a disease which makes her ache all the time. And she wrote Sanatorium as part of a project that she was doing, where she went to this sanatorium, it was kind of like a wellness slash rehabilitation facility in Hungary to help people who have really chronic pain. And she wrote about her experience there. And I was really caught by the book because not only was it talking about pain, which I kept thinking, this amount of pain that I'm in after heartbreak, which I had never, ever in my life experienced, but also in the structure of the book, how fragmented it was in its nature. So I ripped this page off and I wanted to share it with you because I think that it kind of captures the essence of the book. And she writes, "The problem is not that I'm constantly in pain, but the pain wakes me constantly. When I have not slept, I am prone to the following: fatigue, brain fog, paralysis, temporary blindness, floating, climbing out of my body, mid-air encounters with a long deceased and beloved Carmelite saint. My body is having an opiate crisis. I have been trying so hard to stay tethered to the ground. Each pill is a stone. We keep on piling them up, stones and stones and stones in my stomach, all trying to knock me down for long enough to stop the floating." So this aspect of floating, it's this magical kind of world that Abby brings us in. And she talks about her relationship with water and how water is the only thing that really helps her ease the pain, but that she also experiences these out-of-body experiences where she literally spiritually floats out of her body to escape the pain. And I was just in quarantine, that seemed like a fascinating concept to me. And it's not that my pain was like hers or less than or more than hers, but I was just captivated by the fact that somebody could articulate pain and its relationship to place, space, and body so well like she did. So I decided that what I would do was to turn my pain into a project itself. And then I came up with this project, and it became a 5-episode Instagram mini series that I explored through video, audio, and text. And through each episode, I reacted to a particular excerpt from her book. So instead of writing a review of the book, I decided that I was going to do something with film. So I reacted to her fragments while reflecting on my own work, reflecting on quarantine, and reflecting on my own state of being post-breakup. It also draws on the work of architectural historian and filmmaker Anna Anderson. And each video was posted one day after the other, and it became this event. And there was like this virtual red carpet, and we had a series of events, and with a friend of mine who's a professor here, who's a professor of religion and anthropology. We had a psychic come and talk about mysticism, and the event concluded with a conversation with Abby herself talking about the book. So it really became this really interactive thing to do in quarantine. And I didn't think that I was going to make much of it. But then I saw this exhibition that it's called, it escapes me right now, Be My Quarantine exhibition. So it'll be in Portugal. And I submitted this, and I was invited to show the film next year in January. So it was really cool to see that this project that I didn't really have an output for it met their criteria. They were looking for different scales of intimacy and sharing in domestic space. They were asking what was the mental space in the state of physical confinement. They were asking, in the face of new social and physical challenges, how can we represent private space and time in isolation? So the exhibition, which this will be shown, is about mapping times and spaces of isolation in an interdisciplinary way. So they wanted artists and designers from all over the globe who were interested in documenting, archiving, representing critically subjects of time and space in isolation, departing from their personal experiences. During the summer of 2019, during Pride Month, I did this event called Charingas. Charingas means kites. It was a site-based workshop and performance piece that took place between two icons in Old San Juan, El Morro and Cuartel de Valleja. And it was open for members and allies of the LGBTQ community in Puerto Rico. So just to give you a little bit of context of where we are, this is the northernmost tip of Old San Juan. And then at the very top is the fort, El Morro, which was a Spanish fortification designed and built to protect the island from incoming ships. And Cuartel de Valleja is just south of it. So after the 1898 invasion by the US Army, the US infantry occupied the Cuartel de Valleja until 1936. And then during the Second World War, this structure became a hospital. And in 1976, the Puerto Rican government bought the building. And today, it's used as a museum. But the space in front of it, which is where these soldiers and these people are located, today it's used for families to fly kites, typically. And it's really a practice that is evocative of what the traditional wholesome Puerto Rican family should be like. So with Charingas, I did this with my colleague, Cleanthis Kiriakou. We wanted to challenge what family means in our normative context, what it means to be seen in a space that was meant for civilian and military control, to play with the site's history and poke holes in it, and to reclaim a space for the queer community, even if momentarily. So when I do events, I like for them to be very specific to the site that they are going to be held in. So the idea was, Old San Juan was once the site of a network of LGBTQ venues, and this included bars, clubs, guest houses, bathhouses, libraries, stores, cafes, and these were activated largely through the presence of drag performers, particularly from the 1960s. Today, however, there are no explicitly branded queer spaces left. The last venue that we had was called Polo Norte, and it closed in May 2018, a few months after Hurricane Maria hit the island. So in the middle here, in this triptych, is a list of all the places, according to Javier Laureano, and then I added some that have been closed in Old San Juan throughout the past decades, to the point that we have been pushed out of Old San Juan. So the idea was, by flying a set of kites, each representing a queer space which is no longer open, Charingas wanted to queer Puerto Rican tradition and appropriate an iconic space within the city. And in this way, it became an act of queer visibility, of resistance, and appropriation in one of Old San Juan's most policed spaces historically, within this strategic military panopticon used for control and surveillance. So the event was held at the Cuartel de Valleja, which was the barracks. This is where the soldiers were. And we invited people from the LGBTQ community in Puerto Rico and allies as well. And to me, one of the most valuable things that we did was to be able to include a diverse range of people who came of all age groups. I think that when conversations with 18, 19, 20-year-olds mixes with conversations with people who are 62, 63, 64, something really important starts to happen, because these are groups of people who don't really get a lot of spaces in the island to exchange knowledge and experiences. It also brought forth this really cool dynamic where we prepared these kite kits so that everybody could sit at a table in this barracks that was this hyper masculine space for soldiers, and really talk about what it means to be queer and what it means to not have a space in the city anymore. And we had people who came, who visited, who were doing like a summer abroad, and they came and participated. And we had all sorts of different kinds of identities. We had trans people, we had migrants, we had drag house mothers, we had activists. And it really brought forth these different configurations of what it meant to be a family, which is what I think kites in Old San Juan represents. So here, these are the traditional Puerto Rican family, but they're allies who came to support. But then amongst the people that I showed, some of them are people who consider themselves families because of the nature of being queer and the fact that we choose our family so many times. So we wanted also to play with the idea of what it means to do a memorial. So we play with the idea of the procession, of walking and making this long promenade to the front of El Morro. And this is the tiniest picture in the world. I tried to find a bigger one, but I couldn't. So forgive me for the pixelated image, but I really like this image of soldiers lined up within Valleja. And then you have all these queer people coming out of Valleja and kind of disrupting the flow of Old San Juan. And then in front of Valleja, we started reading a list of all the places that have closed and acknowledging them almost as if you had acknowledged a deceased person. And then this image that I had shown before, I think that there's a nice kind of dialogue between Valleja being behind them and the people who are congregated and now being seen. So Laureano writes that homosexuals in San Juan were persecuted, watched, and arrested if they showed affection or sexual attraction in public spaces. So Charingas was about remembering and celebrating all those spaces that are no longer, while marking the presence of a resilient queer community and advocating for a claim over Puerto Rican LGBTQ spaces. So these are some of the kites in flight. And then I always show this image because I love it. The kite that flew the highest and the longest just so happened to say, trans women are women, which is a huge issue right now in Puerto Rico. And I'm not sure what it's like in Illinois at the moment. But it also reminded me of a project that I worked on with my dissertation student last year, Rayleigh Calderon. And he was looking at the fact that in the University of Puerto Rico, there was an effort to transition some restrooms on campus from being gendered, male and female, to being neutral, non-gendered spaces. And that stirred up conversations. So Rayleigh, and I was his primary advisor, was interested in kind of exploring the politics of what it means to segregate people according to genders and how violent it can feel for people who don't subscribe to the gender that they are supposed, whatever that means, to conform to or perform as. So when we were coming up with his research methodology, instead of interviewing many people from the trans community, we thought that we would do a digital ethnographic approach where he looked up different news clips on Facebook in regards to this moment where the University of Puerto Rico transitioned and eliminated certain bathrooms as gendered. And he started reading through the comments to really understand what people were saying about this in an unfiltered way. So it was just like scores upon scores upon scores of transphobic and homophobic and queerphobic comments. And I kept asking him, really, how does this make you feel? Because I know that being bombarded with such negativity all the time must be hard. So as a way to offset that, like he kept saying, I need like a pause from reading all this. So the methodology that we came up with was to take some of those transphobic comments and to represent them almost as if they were technical specs, tech spec drawings that represented exactly what the comment was saying. So this one, for example, and I'll translate, says, oh, now they'll have to pee on the wall, kind of making allusion that because there's going to be more people in the restroom, then there's not going to be enough space for everybody, so they have to pee on the wall. So we took some of these strange comments that were directly related to the architecture of restrooms themselves, and Paley started playing around with them, actually drawing them as if they were built or as if he was solving the problem. So this one, he was addressing people who were saying that now, because you'll have men, women, and everything in between, using the toilet stalls, you could have peeping Toms peek their head over the stall and, you know, and violate people's privacy. So it was like, okay, then are you suggesting that these stalls would need to have little ceilings or little roofs to protect people from looking? So the interesting that started to happen when he was doing this, and I think that this is the most successful one, this was a comment that says, they're going to have to pee in the sink, making allusion to, again, the fact that everybody could use these bathrooms. And what started to happen with this research methodology was that the discourse of homophobia and transphobia, that they were trying to ridiculize people from our community, was that through the act of drawing up this comment without any interpretation, it was just like, this is what it would look like. Then the discourse was reverted, and the person who looked like they were being ridiculous in their statement was the person who was posting this comment. And that took it one step further when we started considering what would it be like if we actually started making like little spatial installations where we would actually put in space these things that people think that they need and represent the needs of the community now that we have mixed bathrooms. And this was happening at an interesting time. And that brings me to Alexa. So at the same time that we're doing this research project, on Sunday, the 23rd of February, 2020, a Facebook user uploaded a picture of a quote unquote man here in Puerto Rico who was quote unquote dressed as a woman, stating that this unknown person was transgressing in the ladies' restroom at a McDonald's located in the town of Toa Baja to harass women and children. The post on Facebook went absolutely viral, and a lot of people in Puerto Rico went on high alert for a supposed pedophile in women's clothing. And before the sun came out on Monday morning, this person was hunted and shot to death. Neolisa Alexa Luciano Ruiz, we learned her name post-mortem, was not a man dressed in a black skirt, as the Facebook post and the Puerto Rican press initially reported. She was a trans woman. This shook me to the core. The fact that, I mean, we have a huge problem in Puerto Rico with trans people, trans women, especially trans women of color, getting murdered. This one to me felt just like an extra personal, because of the fact that it started all through Facebook. And if that Facebook post hadn't been shared, if the bathroom, the restroom itself hadn't been such an issue, then Alexa would probably be alive today. So I took to Facebook and I posted this video that later went viral, and I was asking people of the community and allies to come to the School of Architecture here at the University of Puerto Rico to have a conversation and a night of healing and a vigil in honor of Alexa, and for it to be a forum where we talked about ways where we could come together to protect each other. So the post went viral, and I didn't expect it to. And then the the Puerto Rican press got a hold of it, and it was covered by every major newspaper and channel here. And then, you know, we advertised this at drag events so that people from the community could come. We advertised it on Facebook. We went to the radio and put the call out there. And then on the day of the event, the Puerto Rican press showed up as well. And they covered the event. It had a ton of visibility. And then the idea was to have people bring flashlights, and so that we could march almost like, I always envisioned it as being almost like fireflies marching through the campus, outside of the campus so the cars could see us, and then marching back into campus to the university tower as a symbol of I suppose, of how important this subject was to us, and the role that the university should play in education. So the murder of Alexa, a homeless woman who battled with mental health due to being abused by her family as a child, marks a point of convergence and a crossroads in Puerto Rican queer history. It highlights the urgent need for gender education. It materializes the problem that the binary bathroom as an architectural space presents to queer identities and how they promote transphobia as well as gender violence. It marks the unsafe social context for the LGBTQ people and marginalized people, pointing to an urgent need to create safer spaces. It also attests to the lack of government care for queer people battling with homelessness and mental health. It raises concerns over digital ethics and accountability on what we share on the internet as truth. And it speaks volumes of how the LGBTQ+ community continues to be an ignored, underserved population, particularly when we consider that at the time of writing this conference paper, Alexa's assassin or assassins has not been confirmed, trialed, nor prosecuted. iosos is a site-specific queer digital activist campaign proposed for an exhibition called Queer and Beyond in Berlin next year. And it's a project I worked on with Cleantes Kiriakou, who I also did Charingas with. And it's the very first project that we're doing together for our collaborative Wed Hard agency. So this is the location of the exhibition. It's the, I don't know how to pronounce this because I don't know German, but it's something like the Felddumpf Gallery. So what we were trying to do here is that since the start of the pandemic, queer venues in the island's capital have taken a major hit. And due to many factors, like the ones that we discussed before on migration and the financial crisis, the LGBTQ+ spaces might not be opening again. They've been closed for months. And there are no sanctions, no protective regulations from the government that address queer venues as part of a valuable network of cultural infrastructure. So iosos seeks the help of Berliners to get the government's attention to ensure that queer venues are able to open again after the COVID-19 pandemic subsides. And we see it as a form of digital protest that draws inspiration from a legacy of guerrilla type protests and tactics incorporated by queer activist groups of the past, such as ACT UP. But we also channel the particularities of the internet, such as collaboration, engagement, connectivity, and reward through 3 parts. So this is what we see the installation as. This is the gallery's main facade. So it'll be projections on the facade. And the left, it's a triptych. So the left triptych shows a digital memorial we designed using Rhino, SketchUp, and Illustrator. And it exists in GIF format, commemorating one of Puerto Rico's most famous and long-standing clubs called Circo, which has been closed since the start of the pandemic. So use architectural and ornamental elements characteristic of that particular venue. The memorial evokes notions of closures versus possibilities for rebuilding. The middle triptych features a string of iMessages that we as designers are sending to visitors of the exhibition. It was created via a screen record with the script that we wrote. So we reimagined the gallery's window as an iPhone screen that gets urgently flooded with messages one after the other. And The script for the iMessages acts as an introduction to the spatial politics of queer venues in Puerto Rico today, correlating them to similar instances in Berlin's built environment. And through a series of steps, it encourages users to participate with the artwork itself, which is done by the triptych on the left, and I'll show you that now. So the right triptych shows a QR code floating over a body of water, framed by palm tree leaves. The three images decontextualize viewers from their physical space as hyperfictional images of the Caribbean lure them into the project. When viewers point their smartphone camera to the QR code, iOS launches a pre-drafted email addressed to all of Puerto Rico's government officials, including its senators. I don't know if the quality in via Zoom will be good, but technically you should be able to scan this QR code and see the drafted email, unless the QR code is pixelated in your computer screens. So the aim of iOS OS is to spam the inbox of the local government with messages by allies and members of the queer community in Berlin, with the goal of creating a digital protest, which could very well lead to the creation or the start of the creation or awareness for new public policy schemes for the Puerto Rican queer community. So when participants send the email, they will receive as a thank you gift on our behalf the digital artwork of the memorial, which was displayed on the first triptych, so they can share it or print it and keep it. So in this way, iOS OS creates a network of actions and interactions between its three parts on the triptych, images that always point to one another, between LGBTQ plus people and allies in two different cities in the world, and between protesters demanding immediate action from politicians. And the last project that I want to show you is Queertopia, which is my 2020-2022 research project. And this is still in diapers because I just got this grant a few months ago. So we're starting to do research and get it up and running. So I don't have a lot to show you, but I have ideas that I wanted to share. So this project will be it's born from my previous project, which was these printed maps. So this will be a web-based interactive map. And Queertopia will act as the first architectural and urban register of LGBTQ plus spaces in Puerto Rico from the 1960s until today. By recognizing spaces of queerness within contemporary cartographic practices, Queertopia inserts the buildings and spaces that are significant to the queer community into the island's architectural history, its cultural infrastructure, its urban memory, and hopefully its political future. The map will be both an archival artifact and a speculative research method, testing innovative approaches between urban field research and socially oriented GIS technologies. Apart from mapping spaces and places, Queertopia presents and allows user-generated submissions of various sets of spatial information depending on the place. Because historically, queer spaces in Puerto Rico have been excluded from the very representations of space and from architectural discourse, the proposal for Queertopia considers that the act of mapping is a political act in itself. It's a reclaiming of space in the search for equality and the right to the city. And it parts from Benjamin Bratton's claim that if one is unaddressed, one cannot speak or be spoken to, both in terms of calling someone out and in terms of not having a physical address in the built environment. In other words, those people who are unseen, cast aside, invisibilized, or erased are those who we continually ignore. And for marginalized communities, such as the queer community, this is problematic in terms of human rights. And as we've seen with the case of Alexa and so many other trans people who have been murdered this year alone, is increasingly dangerous in terms of safety and survival. Historically, maps have been used, this is where the idea comes from, they've been used as tools of sovereignty, of power and control. And they're artifacts of desire and fantasy that are presented to us as if they are objective truths, particularly in the age of satellite and GIS technologies. But maps have also been used by minorities as tools of subversion and resistance. And depending on the map maker, maps have the power to make visible entire populations, practices, places, and processes which challenge normativity while creating alternate understandings of our communities societies, built environments, and the politics that govern over them. So these are some of the references that we've been looking in of ways that Puerto Rico has been drawn and represented through its history to see how much of this new map responds to the formal vocabularies of Puerto Rican cartographic history. Queertopia, though, will act as a resource to address, discuss, and theorize on the spatial politics of Puerto Rican queer culture. I have the hope that it will be a tool to advocate for civil rights, democratic inclusion, and queer safety. I want it to be a living archive that documents LGBTQ+ spaces and buildings and events in the island in real time. And also it'll be an experimental research method rooted on developing and testing innovative approaches between urban field research and GIS technologies. So in this way, Queertopia challenges the dominant discourses of gender and sexuality within architectural discourse. And although the relationship between gender and architecture has been explored by key architectural scholars such as Dorothy Coleman, Barbara Penner, Beatriz Colomina, to name a few, these figures do not engage with the complexities of queerness as a central topic. Furthermore, much of what we do know about queer LGBTQ spaces is based primarily on white male experiences, constructed largely after a North American and Eurocentric scope. And a prime example of this is architectural theorist Aaron Betsky's seminal book, Queer Space, Architecture and Same-Sex Desire, which he published in '97. But as an immense umbrella of non-normative identities, practices, and locations, queer includes a diversity of people who do not necessarily fall under the widely known gay categories. And as important as Betsky's book is, 2 decades later, we must note that he was not talking about queer spaces. Aaron Betsky was talking about gay spaces. And the central thesis of his book, which was the purpose of queer space is ultimately sex, is absolutely reductive, simplistic, and completely erroneous. So my Queertopia project, along with all the other projects that I've shared tonight, hopefully does a part to help fill the gap in scholarship that we have within architectural discourse regarding queerness, particularly through minority-produced, non-white scholarship exploring the architectures of a Latin American LGBTQ+ community in a colonized Caribbean context. And that concludes my presentation.